Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Brussels Sprouts. As our Brussels Sprouts listeners know, NATO marked its 75th anniversary this year, a testament to the strength and continued relevance of the alliance. To mark this historic anniversary with audiences outside of Washington, D.C., CNAS partnered with Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, to host a panel discussion. The distinguished panel reflected on the achievements of the alliance over the past 75 years, considered the challenges that NATO might face in the next 75 years, and examined why NATO remains as relevant as ever to Americans across the country. We are bringing this discussion directly to our Brussels Sprouts listeners, and we hope you enjoy it. In the discussion, you'll hear from Ambassador Anniken Huitfeldt, the Norwegian ambassador to the USA, and who previously served as Norwegian foreign minister from 2021 to 2023. Mark Newton, the Minister of Defense and Director for the USA at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. Maria Markowska is the first counselor and head of the political section at the Polish Embassy in Washington, D.C., and Dr. John Deni is a research professor of joint, interagency, intergovernmental, and multinational security studies at the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute. The panel was moderated by Dr. Rebecca Moore, who is a professor of political science at Concordia College.
Thank you, Dean Wentling and President Ervin. So as Dean Wentling has noted, NATO currently faces a very different strategic environment than it did during the Cold War period, one that is populated by an increasingly diverse and global assortment of threats and challenges, which I hope we can explore this evening. But I'd like to begin our discussion with a question about the relevance of NATO to U.S. interests as well as the role of the United States in NATO. We know that in invading Ukraine in 2014 and 2022, Russian President Putin challenged the most basic principles underpinning the rules-based international order, which the U.S. took the lead in establishing following the end of the Second World War, including principles of respect for state sovereignty and territorial integrity. Moreover, Russia has received significant moral and material support from China, North Korea, and Iran, all of whom increasingly appear to be engaged in a collective effort to undermine the current international order and the liberal democratic norms associated with it. Indeed, the recently released report of the Bipartisan Commission on the National Defense Strategy observed that this alignment of countries opposed to U.S. interests, quote, creates a real risk, if not likelihood, that conflict anywhere could become a multi-theater or a global war, end quote. And yet Americans today appear increasingly weary of global engagement, including even U.S. membership in NATO. A Pew Research Center poll conducted in early April 2024 found that the percentage of Americans who believe that the United States benefits from its membership in the alliance has dropped by about 4% over the past 2 years. And the percentage who believe that the United States is providing too much assistance to Ukraine has grown significantly. So I'd like to ask each of you to respond to two questions. First, why should Americans regard membership in NATO and global engagement generally as beneficial to U.S. interests and to their own lives? And secondly, what might be the impact on European security of even gradual American disengagement from Europe? So, Ambassador Huitfeldt, would you like to begin?
Yes. First, I want to say I'm so excited to be here. I was appointed as ambassador 5 weeks ago. And when I asked the former ambassador, where shall I go first? They said, go to the Midwest. So I was so excited this morning that I thought I could take a run out in the morning when it was very dark, 6 o'clock. And I had a serious fall. So I had a lot of blood here and I fall on my 4th teeth. So I thought I might not go. But I had my 4th teeth. I looked terrible this morning. You told me we met on the plane. So I'm so happy to be here. There is now more discussion in the US about NATO membership than before. I think as Europeans, we should really understand why it is so. When I travel around in the US, to very small towns, I can see pictures on the main street of young people who have given their lives in different wars all over the world, in Vietnam, in Iraq, and in Korea, Iraq. So I think we really have to understand how the American people think and feel. They have given a lot to the international community. After the Second World War, you often also have contributed a lot to European defense. When we're talking about money and also about the capabilities. So Europeans, we really have to step up. And we will do that in Norway. So it's easy maybe to say that you should take care of the security in Europe yourself. But I will tell you a story about the Norwegian security, because Norway was one of the very few members of NATO from the very beginning. The only NATO member with a land border to Russia 75 years ago. And this is very important because next to our border is one of the world's biggest naval bases in the world on the Russian side. Some says the second largest after Norfolk. Maybe the British one is bigger. I don't know what's your assessment on that. But it's the biggest Russian base, naval base. And they also carry a lot of nuclear weapons on their submarines. And why are they situated here, very, very close to the Norwegian border? And this is very important for those who are interested in geography, because this is the warmest part of the Arctic. Russia's problem is that Russia is basically landlocked during winter. It's ice all over, so they have their huge naval capabilities very, very close to the Norwegian border. So they don't mean to attack Norway with these nukes. They are aimed to target the United States. So if we don't take care of your security up in the high north, that will not benefit the United States. So we have to cooperate on this. I mean, Norway is a very small country, only 5 million people. If there is going to be a war with Russia, that would be a problem, certainly for us, but there will also be a problem for you. So that's why we have to work together. So I think NATO makes the US stronger. We take care of your interests up in the high north, so it's no alternative, I believe, to a strong NATO.
Thank you. Before I say anything else, thank you very much to CNAS and to Concordia College for hosting us all this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I had children, I used to every summer kind of try and take road trips across the United States, and I've never made it this far north. So this evening will be the 40th state in the United States I've spent the night in. I've been to South Dakota previously. I recognized Sioux Falls as we were driving here from Fargo. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and the opportunity to be on such a distinguished panel. I always feel slightly embarrassed when I'm hearing the kind of level of achievement of my kind of fellow panelists. So thank you very much to that. And thank you for the audience for coming out here on a kind of Tuesday night to come and listen to us. There's a kind of million other things that you can be doing. So thank you for your interest in the topic. I didn't think I'd have to correct the record this early on, but I don't remember telling you that you look terrible. I don't think that's a word I would have used. Nervousness, slight fear, wondering what was going to happen to us when we got here, kind of when I saw what was... But terrible is not a word I would have used. Why does...
You are British. You would never ever use that word.
Why? I mean, I might use it to describe British cooking, but no. Why does NATO matter to Europe? Look, the rules-based international order does not sound very glamorous. Nobody likes those words. Rules-based isn't very fun. Order is not very fun. International gets a bad rep. But, for the last 80 years, NATO has ensured stability, security, prosperity all around the globe. that's in the interest of the US, it's in the interest of the UK, all of us. And adherence to those international norms and our other values, mutual respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, human rights, resolving disputes peacefully, freedom of navigation, all of that has helped create stability in which all of us can prosper. And I mean, I always think the first place to come at this question from is that prosperity piece. NATO protects US prosperity as much as it protects national security. Transatlantic trade thrives through the security and the stability that NATO provides. US-European goods and services trade, I think, at an all-time high last year. It's about $1.2 trillion. That's more than twice the level of trade between the US and China. And it's a significant factor in how the world works and why the world works. Euro-Atlantic security is US security. And NATO is at its core. The threats and the challenges facing us continue to evolve, as we heard at the start. NATO's role has never been more crucial, regardless of whether that's us talking about Russia and its illegal invasion in Ukraine, or whether it's us talking about, how Beijing and Tehran are working ever more closely with the Russians and watching all of us and what we do. NATO has never been more vital in countering and pushing back against those threats, and it is the most successful and enduring defense alliance in history. Been keeping North Americans and Europeans safe for 75 years, protects 1 billion citizens. So it's protected us from Soviet aggression, it's supported the US in the response to 9/11, it's deterring Russian aggression again now. But as my ambassador colleague says, the US can't care more about European security than Europe does. And that's one of the reasons I welcome this conversation, other conversations that we are having, because I think it's absolutely right that we should have the future, that we should have the conversation about what the future of European security looks like. And I'm looking forward to getting into it in more detail with everybody here tonight. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm also very glad to be here. Thank you for the Concordia College, thank you for CNIS for hosting us today. I'm particularly glad because I can continue the mission of my foreign minister who visited Washington in September, and he said during his speech at the Johns Hopkins University that he came to the United States in order to tell the Americans why NATO is important. He was supposed to go to Michigan and also have the very similar speech, but unfortunately he had to cut his stay short because the Prime Minister called him back to Warsaw. But that's also one of the reasons why I'm particularly glad I'm able to be here and speak to you about NATO. When President Biden said at his speech during the NATO summit in July in Washington, he said that NATO is here to prevent war, NATO is here to protect democracy, and NATO is here to bring peace and prosperity for the whole Euro-Atlantic area. Why this is important? It's extremely important because that gives us credibility, that gives us strength, and is a projection of our strength against all the threats that are coming to our territories, being it to the United States, being it to Europe, being it to Canada, and any other allies. When we look actually when NATO for the first and the only time invoked the Article 5, it was after the 9/11 attacks. That was in order to protect the US against an external threat. Poland has stood up as all the other NATO allies. We've been a very reliable partner to the United States. More than 33,000 Polish soldiers participated in the mission in Afghanistan, also within the ISAF mission. In the peak, we had 2,600 soldiers in Afghanistan. So this is one of the reasons why it is so extremely important for Americans to be the part of the alliance and be also the leader of this alliance. The other issue that Mark mentioned is the prosperity. When we look, for example, for the foreign direct investments of the US in the European Union, in 2022, and these are the data from the USDR, $2.7 trillion have been invested in the European Union. Why are they able to be invested? Because there is security in Europe, because of the transatlantic alliance that keeps this region stable and secure. They wouldn't be this prosperous without the security that NATO gave. And maybe one more thing we're talking a lot about right now, decoupling from China. I mean, this is also one of the reasons we need to have the security and prosperity in order for our economies to thrive and in order to project our values democracy, the rule of law. These are all the values that we all share. So this is one also a very important reason why that's important for the Americans. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me also thank CNAS and Dr. Moore at Concordia College. You know, one of the students asked me out in the hallway here, rather bluntly, so why are you here? And I said, well, Dr. Moore called and I answered. It was pretty obvious, right? The dean, I think, in the interest of brevity, underemphasized Dr. Moore's background. You should know she is a nationally and internationally known scholar and expert of NATO. And I'm not kidding around when I say that when Dr. Moore called, I answered. So it's a pleasure to be here. Because Uncle Sam signs my paychecks, I must begin with a disclaimer. We've got academic freedom at the War College, but the views I express are mine alone and don't necessarily reflect those of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or the Department of the Army. Rebecca, when you mentioned the polling, I tend to take a glass is half full view of that. For example, that same poll in April of this year indicated that 58% of Americans have a higher opinion, have a high opinion of NATO. That's close to the historical average and a couple of points higher than it was back in 2009. Another poll done by the Chicago Council, not far from here, in June of this year, found that 67% of Americans consider NATO essential. That's, again, near the historical average and 3 points higher than it was in 2009. Another Chicago Council poll from September of last year, so about a year old, found that 78% of Americans want our government to either maintain or increase its commitment to NATO. That's, again, close to the historical average of the last decade, but it's up 20 percentage points since the 1970s. So from my perspective, I think Americans are right. They get it. They get the value of NATO. Now, if you scratch the surface of that polling, you'll find that a lot of Americans, frankly, don't really understand in detail what NATO does. But let me give you my top 4 reasons for why NATO matters to the United States. Reason number 1 is pretty simple. If you care about having a job, you ought to care about NATO. As was mentioned briefly earlier, the trade and investment relationship between our country and Europe, that's the two-way trade in goods and services, is twice as high as it is with China. 2.5 million American jobs directly depend upon that trade and investment relationship. In contrast, a little over 900,000 U.S. jobs depend upon the same vis-a-vis China. Even with regard to debt, our national debt, right? It's huge. We're all worried about that. The fact is, Americans hold most of that debt, okay? But of the debt that's not owned by Americans, the Europeans own twice as much of it as China. They hold twice as much of it as China. Japan holds more than China. So for all these reasons, Europe is a vital part of our economy. Now, how many economists are there in the room here? Professors, students? Well, okay, not many. Well, I'll ask you anyway. Does capital flee instability or does capital get attracted to instability? Capital flees. Capital flees instability, okay? This is what the founders of NATO recognized 75 years ago, and that's why they founded it. That's why it still matters today. So in very concrete terms, if the Russians win in Ukraine, that will unleash a wave of instability across Eastern Europe, okay? That assumes the Russians stop there. And if you talk to Poles or Estonians or Lithuanians or Latvians, they'll tell you they don't have that confidence that Russia will stop there. If that unfolds in a negative way, instability across Europe, the demise of the European economy, and an inability of Europeans to buy the stuff that we make. Here in Minnesota, European countries account for 4 of your top 10 export markets. European exports account for 20% of Minnesota exports, more than twice that you send to China. This relationship is vital to you here in the middle of the country, and it's largely because of jobs. But let me give you 3 other reasons. The first is a little broader. It's been our grand strategy in the U.S. for the last century to try to avoid the rise of a single, protectionist, predatory power on the European landmass. We've been at that for over 100 years. It's why we got drawn into 3 wars over the course of the 20th century, the 2 world wars and the Cold War. That mission still exists today. The third reason is burden sharing and risk sharing. Now, I know that gets a bad rap among some in our country, but the fact is European defense spending has been increasing since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, which, by the way, is 2014. That's when European defense spending began to ramp up. Europeans began taking more responsibility. And now, since 2022, Europeans outpace Americans in humanitarian, financial, and military assistance, collectively and bilaterally, given to the Ukrainians. If we look at what we did back in Iraq and Afghanistan, now we can question the wisdom of those decisions, but those operations would not have been possible without Europeans, who provided roughly 1/3 of the troops on the ground in both those conflicts. So burden sharing and risk sharing are critical. And the fourth and final reason is because it's a community of shared values. We tend to view the world in the same way. These are friends we can count on when it comes to the UN, or engaging in economic policy vis-a-vis protectionist countries, or in non-proliferation issues vis-a-vis Iran. This community matters to us, and it helps us in when we are pursuing our own national interests all over the world. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I have another question I'd like to pose to all of you. This one concerning the interconnected nature of the threats currently facing NATO. So as noted earlier, Russia has found support from a number of autocratic states in its ongoing war with Ukraine, including China, which NATO described during its July summit to be a, quote, decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. But we've also witnessed strong support for Ukraine from NATO's Indo-Pacific partners, specifically Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, highlighting the extent to which these liberal democratic states in the Indo-Pacific believe that the threat Russia poses to Ukraine is a global threat. And in fact, the former Japanese prime minister has repeatedly stated that what is happening in Ukraine today could happen in Asia tomorrow. So in short, it's become increasingly evident that threats to the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific areas are interconnected. So again, I have 2 related questions. First, can NATO remain a primarily regional alliance and still fulfill its core tasks in an era of increasingly global and interconnected threats? But I would also appreciate your thoughts on an idea embraced by some in U.S. foreign policy circles who believe that the time has come for a kind of division of labor among the NATO allies, under which the United States would direct its focus and resources to the challenge that China poses in the Indo-Pacific, while Europe would assume primary responsibility for Ukraine and threats to the European continent. Would such a division of labor serve the interests of the NATO allies? Would you like to start this time?
Well, I don't think a division of labor will benefit American interests. I really think that European countries, we have to step up. As you just said, we are doing so. We will increase our presence from Norway in the area at sea and on land because we will buy more, air fighters, submarines, everything, to be more present in our own areas. And also be able and willing to give more assistance to Ukraine because this is in our own interest. I don't believe in expanding the geographical area of NATO. I think this should be a transatlantic defense alliance. I think it's the best way to preserve, both American and European interests, to keep it that way. But I also think we must understand that the US will pay more focus and more attention to the threats in the South China Sea in the years to come. Therefore, we need to step up as Europeans to be able to see the global obligation the US has to save. And we really have to understand what kind of signals we will send to not even Russia if we now step down. What kind of signals we will send then? The signals we will send then is that as democracy and democracies, we don't have the patience to stay in a conflict. If we step down, there will be a serious signal to the Russia that they can continue. So if Russia wins now, that will have serious consequences for very many other countries in the future. So I think we need to increase our militarily and also humanitarian support to Ukraine, and we will continue to do so together with other European countries.
John's too smart to speak last every turn, so I'm going to let him go next and I'll come in at the end.
That's a compliment, I think that is. But yeah, thank you. Thank you, I think.
I'm going to be in danger of having insulted every panelist at this rate.
Yeah. Should NATO remain regional? You know, I think, unfortunately, Rebecca, it must. Frankly, it lacks the capability, the capacity, and the will to become a global alliance, right? And I don't know if that's in American interests either at this point. But I think what Americans can expect of our European allies is to address those threats that emanate from the Indo-Pacific but manifest in the Euro-Atlantic. What are those? The first and most obvious one is the decisive enabler role that China is playing right now in Russia's war against Ukraine. Right? I think that the Chinese perceive the European red line to be no finished weapon systems. Okay? And the Chinese are giving all manner of precursors, materials, et cetera, for the Russians to build systems. There's some emerging evidence in the press just in the last week or two that, in fact, the Russians are now building drones in China and getting those shipped across the border. That would, in theory, right, violate European red lines and demand more action. But there are other problems also. The Chinese, as they are doing here, are engaged in Europe every day, engaging in cyber attacks, and stealing, and other ways of stealing intellectual property, which really translates again into jobs, right? Lost IP is lost jobs. And then the third way in which threats in the Indo-Pacific manifest in Europe is by these extraterritorial policing offices that the Chinese have established all over Europe to police their own citizens and to stifle open debate. So I think at a minimum, we can expect that. We should demand that of our European allies. I think they're heading in that direction, but it's slow. With regard to the division of labor, if a division of labor means the Americans get out of Europe so we can focus on the Indo-Pacific, I think that is a recipe for disaster. I mean, whether we like it or not, the Russians view us differently, right? I mean, in the Russian world, not every country is equally sovereign. Some countries matter more than others, and the Americans happen to matter in their eyes. So if we leave the continent, the instability I spoke of earlier and the fleeing of the capital, that is almost preordained. But if we're talking a division of labor within Europe, that might make sense. Like if I were the king of NATO for a day, I'd have the Germans focused on northeastern Europe, right, and the land fight. I'd have the Brits focused on the Baltic Sea, Scandinavia, and the High North, given their strong naval tradition and their linkages already with those countries. And I'd have the French, Italians, and Spanish focus on the Mediterranean basin and North Africa. Maybe we ask the Turks to focus on Iran and Syria, for example, right? That division of labor, I think, is necessary in the short run, given all that we're doing to try to build up capabilities and arm Ukraine all at the same time. It's a tough load.
To go first? Thank you. So I'm not sure if we like the division of labor term in Warsaw. I think our foreign minister prefers to call it the strategic harmony, and he said it publicly during one of his events when he was here in Washington in February. Strategic harmony, meaning also Europeans stepping up. I mean, what and the Norwegian ambassador just said. We need to take more responsibility. We need to invest in our defense industry. We need to invest in our defense capabilities. But we have to do it in within the strategic harmony with the United States. I think this is the future, how the alliance should work. And Poland does recognize that this is extremely important. We spent this year 4.2% of our GDP on defense, and next year we're going to go up to 4.7% of our GDP, which is right now on the very, very top of the NATO spendings, because we understand there is threat to the Euro-Atlantic community. There is direct threat to Poland. And when we look also at the communique from the Washington summit, the communique actually says that Russia still is the most significant and most direct threat to allies' security. So that's why we need to take responsibility. When it comes, to other challenges and other threats, yes, there are other challenges. They are very different nature. That's why I think NATO is making a lot of attempts to address all these threats in this all-domain approach. When we saw also at the Washington summit, the flagship project with AP4 countries, we started talking about cyber activities. We started talking about AI. We started talking about disinformation. These are all non-conventional threats, but they are all very visible, and they are starting to be more prevalent, and they are starting to be more direct to our security. In hybrid threats, we also saw this in communique from the latest NATO summit. That are so direct for us, that can also be a reason to invoke Article 5 in the future. So I think NATO does not only need to look at the conventional threat, which is of course very big, but also on all sort of other threats that are coming from different parts of the world.
Thank you. Just really quickly on your first question, look, I think NATO is evolving to think about other threats that are going to manifest in the Euro-Atlantic area. And as John was talking about, trying to work out what China's ambitions are and kind of its malevolent intent in the Euro-Atlantic is important. But I just want to touch on the division of labour piece in a slightly different way, because it depends kind of on what you mean by a division of labour. US, dumbing it down, US kind of warfighting strategy for a very long time was to be able to fight and win two wars at the same time. And it's no longer that, really. It's being able to fight one war and deter any others from starting. And as we were hearing about at the start, we are seeing this developing kind of axis of resistance that are looking to learn from each other and potentially throw challenges up at us in multiple theatres in the same time in different places. So trying to work out how we collectively can fight that one war and deter all others is important. And trying to make sure that we've got the right mix of capabilities to be able to deter those wars from breaking out in other places will be something that we've really got to think about very clearly as we get to the back half of this decade and into the next. And that's why I think we talk about an increasing indivisibility between not often enough for me to be able to say the word indivisibility properly, but there we go, better on the second time. Increasing indivisibility between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. And that's why we're increasing our conversations with Australia, Japan, New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, in NATO fora. It's why outside of NATO, the UK, together with the US and Australia, have been taking forward the AUKUS initiative that some people in the room might have heard of, primarily focused on nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines to try and make sure that we can continue to provide that deterrence effect, but also looking at what else we can provide in the nearer term. Because we should be under no doubt that China has ambitions and policies that challenge our interests, our security, our values, is undertaking a range of grey zone activity, sometimes not a million miles away from the Russian playbook, learning from each other. So ensuring that as an alliance we can detect, that we can deter, that we can respond to that malign activity, I think is a priority. And I think it shows why a division of labour can work if you're talking about capabilities and intent, perhaps not so much if you're talking about geographic focus.
Thank you. So the question of defense spending has come up, and I'd like to pose a question. I'm going to direct this one to John and to Mark, but anyone can jump in. NATO confirmed during the Washington summit that 2/3 of NATO members have now met or exceeded the defense spending target set by NATO in 2006, which is 2% of GDP. We know that the sum of assistance to Ukraine provided by Europe as a whole actually exceeds that provided by the United States. And NATO agreed this past summer to play a larger role in terms of coordinating security assistance and training for Ukraine, in addition to approving minimum baseline funding as one means of ensuring that assistance for Ukraine is sustained regardless of political developments in the United States. But I'm wondering, are these increases in European defense spending sustainable, particularly given that even more assistance for Ukraine will undoubtedly be needed? And I believe UK Prime Minister Starmer has actually proposed that NATO would now adopt a target of 2.5% of GDP for defense spending for all members. So I'm wondering, is that feasible? And what are the prospects for a strong European defense pillar within NATO, particularly given that the UK is now outside of the European Union?
I'm not going to talk about that part. That's how I get into a lot of trouble. I think it's welcome that after years of reducing defence budgets, NATO allies are reducing those cuts, increasing their defence spending. I think it's really welcome that collectively NATO will spend over 2% of their GDP on defence now. The UK currently spends about 2.3%. We have said that we will move to 2.5%. I'm not sure that we've said everyone should move to 2.5%. I mean, I wish they did. I wish everyone moved to the 4.7% that Poland is going to be spending. Personally, I wish that UK spending was higher than 2.5%. I mean, there's an awful lot more that we could do and that we would want to do should that figure be higher. We're in the middle of a strategic defence review where I'm trying my best to argue that we need to do more. But I think for far too long, we have underfunded and hollowed out capabilities. And I think it is very important that we make sure that European leg is sustainable, because we've said a couple of times on this stage now that Europeans have provided more assistance to Ukraine than the US has. We would not be in the place that we are in Ukraine if it wasn't for that American support. And we are incredibly grateful for everything that has been done and been provided. I speak to enough Ukrainians to know how incredibly grateful they are, and I wouldn't want that to be misrepresented. I think President Putin made an enormous strategic mistake. Thought that he would fight a war in a weekend that's now entering its third year and has been responsible for hundreds of thousands of Russian deaths that he does his best to gloss over. Going back to your original question, I think there is much more that we need to do to make sure that in Europe we have the enablers that we need, that we have the stockpiles that we need. They've been depleted by what we've provided to Ukraine. That we make sure that we are not as dependent on the US for certain capabilities as we have been for a little while. That we can strengthen our logistics and our supply chains. There is more for us to do. But I do think there has been a recognition since 2014, because of what Russia's done, because of what President Trump said. He was very effective in lobbying for more European spending on defence. But frankly, every US administration, most British administrations have said the same thing for decades. It's important that that message, I think, has landed and been understood, and I think there will be a strong European defence pillar in NATO going forward. Has to be.
I would draw a little bit of a distinction between the reasons for increased European defense spending. As Mark rightly points out, every president since, Harry Truman has beaten the drum of more defense spending from our European friends. But it really didn't turn around, at least in the last 30 years, until 2014. And what happened in 2014? Well, two really big events. The first was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the second was the rise of ISIS, right? I mean, well, it didn't rise then, but it had been rising for a year or two. The point is, European defense spending responds to threats. Does that surprise anybody? It shouldn't, right? I mean, that's pretty intuitive, I think. It doesn't necessarily respond to browbeating and cajoling from across the Atlantic Ocean. But in any case, my concern, Rebecca, is that the trajectory of defense spending, while going in the right direction, is not necessarily sustainable at the same rate that we have seen. Now, why do I think that? There are some pretty strong fiscal headwinds affecting the big countries in Europe. And who are those? I think of them as the UK, the Brits, the French, the Germans. The Poles are close on their heels. But those first four I mentioned, four of them together account for 2/3 of non-US NATO military spending. Okay, 2/3. So if those four countries aren't really pulling their weight, it's going to take the alliance overall a long time, to really replace the stocks that they've given to Ukraine, to build up their own capabilities and capacity to fulfill NATO's new defense plans. We've got a whole new array of defense plans to deal with the Russians, right? First time since the Cold War we've had that. And to continue aiding the Ukrainians. So some of these challenges are cyclical, you know, the coming and going of the economic trends. Some are structural, right? I mean, the big one that we maybe don't want to dive into is Brexit, right? That's a structural challenge for the Brits. But we look at Germany, they've got a high trade dependency in some industries on China. We look elsewhere at our French and Italian friends, and they've got some problems with the looseness of their labor market that inhibits their economic growth. My point is, these are not problems that can necessarily be solved in the short run. Now, I think there's going to be movement at the summit next year. Next year's summit is in The Hague, and maybe the tagline will be 2.5 in 25. But I don't know if the allies will achieve that very soon. I suspect, in fact, they will not. What does that mean for NATO? It means NATO can still fight tonight, right? Don't get me wrong. NATO is ready for war, but we just might take a few more knocks on the chin than we would otherwise. We would take on more risk in military parlance in the short run.
Thank you. Ambassador, I'm wondering if I could ask you a question about Finland and Sweden. These two states have just joined the NATO alliance within the last 2 years. Both have been very active members in NATO's Partnership for Peace for many years, so they're not strangers to the NATO alliance. But given their geography and military capabilities, their new status as NATO members has the potential to have a significant impact on the alliance and security in Europe. So I'm wondering if you might share what you believe to be the likely impact of these two new members on NATO, but not only on NATO's ability to fulfill its collective defense responsibilities, but also the nature of the alliance itself.
First of all, when Finland took the decision, I think that was actually before the war. Because Putin gave a speech in December 2021 where he told the world that NATO should not expand. And that was what he said. If that's not going to happen, I will invade Ukraine. That was his threat at that time. And for Finland, that reminded them very strongly about the past. That Russia, as their eastern neighbor, could dictate their, international alliances. So at that point, I think they took the decision. I was very close, I worked very closely with the Finnish foreign minister at that time, and our prime minister worked very closely with the Finnish president, and they took the decision then. And after that, it was difficult for Sweden to stand alone outside. Sweden had for very many years thought that they could trust on an implicit security alliance. That really meant that if we are going to be attacked by Russia or other countries, United States will come and save us. That was what they thought. But after the invasion of Ukraine, they really thought through this and thought we need an explicit security guarantee. And for Norway, this means a lot, because back in the days, we were not there. But 75 years ago, it was very, very difficult that Sweden chose another path than Norway. It was so difficult when Winston Churchill visited Norway. I was not there, this was 75 years ago. The Prime Minister went to his cabin. He got a depression because he understood that he would not get Sweden into NATO. So, it's a huge achievement for Norway, because these are very, very close countries. We are very similar, such similar people. And in case of an invasion, they are very close to us. So this means a lot. But I must say, we are also very different, because we have a border to Russia up in north, in these very, very rough waters. So, I mean, Finland and Sweden have very different military capabilities than Norway. We have very strong submarines. We have strong air force and air fighters. So on that, we can work strongly together. The armies can also work strongly together. But, I mean, in the Barents Sea, we have to rely on Britain and the US. So that will mean a lot to the common European security and also to the Norwegian security.
Okay, thank you. So I have one additional question, and then I think we'll move to questions from the audience. But I'd like to address this question to Maria. So we know that since 2014, NATO has made considerable efforts to reinforce deterrence. John alluded to this earlier, by strengthening its capacity to make good on its collective defense obligations to Poland and the Baltic states, which are increasingly vulnerable in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine. But the security environment currently facing NATO is extremely complex, with threats to NATO territory and NATO citizens arising from well beyond Russia, including the Middle East, North Africa, the Sahel regions. And notably, NATO has identified terrorism as the most direct asymmetric threat to the security of its citizens. So I'm wondering, what key challenges do you believe NATO needs to still address if it is to effectively deter and defend against an increasingly diverse assortment of threats stemming not only from Europe, but increasingly other corners of the world?
Thank you so much for this question. I think we can look a little bit into the history. So since 2014 was, I think John mentioned before, I mean, NATO actually went through a transformation. I think we can call it a transformation. And when General Cavalli, the Supreme Allied Command for Europe, was speaking in Washington, one of the events in April, he actually said that NATO revitalized its collective defense. And that's what happened. From conflict management and conflict prevention, we actually had to move towards the collective defense and one of the core issues of the alliance. We did a tremendous job. As all the allies did a tremendous job, and I think we can look back towards the Warsaw NATO summit in 2016, when for the first time we actually adopted the decision to establish 4 battle groups in the NATO Eastern Flag. At the time, I remember, was still, a little hesitant as the allies to call it NATO Eastern Flank, but that's actually what it was. I mean, what it still is, and is right now. It's in our dictionary, and that was within the enhanced forward presence of NATO, and was one of very important steps for the whole alliance, how it started to adapt to the new threat, a new threat that was coming again from a state actor that we thought that we probably wouldn't have such an actor again being a threat to the Euro-Atlantic security, and we had to change. And I mean, then the consecutive NATO summits, the summits in Madrid, the summits in Vilnius, and in Washington, were basically cementing these decisions. I mean, with NATO defense plans that John also mentioned, I think that was a tremendous decision for the first time since the Cold War that we had actually defense plans in the situation that we have to consider that we may need to use them. So this is extremely important. But talking also about the other threats that you mentioned, Rebecca, I think I briefly also referred to them previously. We do see a lot of significant other threats, not only conventional threats, the hybrid activities. I mean, the Russians, and other actors as well, are very sophisticated. What we have seen at the Polish border in the recent years, particularly in the Polish-Belarusian borders, it's a pure example of weaponization of migrations, a state-organized weaponization of migration by the Belarusian state, what basically was pushing migrants through the Polish border, through the Belarusian-Polish border towards the Polish territory, in order to divide our society, in order to, take the attention from what's happening in Ukraine and how the Belarusian territory is being used more and more to attack Ukraine. But yeah, that's basically one of the examples of how hybrid activities can be very dangerous. What we've seen also, it can be a threat to our security. What we've seen also in Poland and other European countries very recently, it's the wave of sabotage, arsons, very common, very recent times in Poland. These were all malign activities that are being, directed by very likely state actors, or some actors that are connected with some other states. And these threats, they require a response. They definitely require an allied response. And then another threat that I can mention also, disinformation. The disinformation, what we've been seeing, it's also an unprecedented scale. So what we need to do, how we need to address, first and foremost, I think, is the resilience of our societies. We need to teach our society, we need to show them and tell them, what actually is disinformation, what's misinformation, and what are the threats that are very dangerous to our own security. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll move to taking some questions from the audience now. And we should have a slide with instructions for submitting.
I dearly hope so.
Questions.
There we go.
Okay.
So I'm Dr. Nicholas Howard. I teach political science here at Concordia College. And please submit your questions through either of these methods. They'll come to me anonymized, so I don't know who you are when I receive them. So apologies if I don't get to your question in advance. But I'm going to reserve the right of first to ask essentially the panelists. So one of the things that we talk a lot about at Concordia College is environmental sustainability, climate change. We teach courses on biology and environmental sustainability. So I'm going to ask a two-part question to the panel. So as climate change begins to accelerate, how does NATO view the growing risks of climate-related conflicts? And additionally, how is NATO preparing to address the security risk posed by that climate change in regions that are already vulnerable to political and social unrest?
Would anyone like to take
Yeah, happy to. This is the bit where I don't have any notes, so it's good. I can. So I think the UK has tried to understand for a while now what changes to the climate is going to mean for our military and for our defence. And NATO is doing work on climate security now as well. I think there's a number of angles through which you can come at this. I mean, we, and I can't remember how much of it is public, but we wrote a report on the impacts to climate, to the ability of our military to do basic things like train. We have operating bases kind of all over the world. We were finding that in our bases in Cyprus, for example, the number of days in which it was too hot for the army to actually train outside was growing exponentially over a period of years. We looked at the water temperature that a number of our vessels were kind of built to be able to operate in, and found that, over a period of years, there was already, and it was going to get worse, kind of restrictions on where those vessels could go. I think looking at how we look after our training estates, looking at how we make fuel-efficient vehicles is going to be important. If in 30, 40 years' time, everybody else is operating electric vehicles and the DOD, the MOD, the collective defense establishments of the world are the only people still trying to make gasoline engines work, we're going to find that we have a problem. So it's just being conscious of the world in which you live in. You can extrapolate that out to the conflicts that are then starting to break out around the world because of climate. And Sudan, I think there are questions there about how much of it is about climate. The kind of situation at the moment in East Africa, when the kind of Ethiopians are looking at building a dam, which will then affect kind of Egyptian water supply, and that's having a significant impact on the Horn of Africa. What all of that means for migration. There are questions that NATO has got to deal with. I think individually our kind of countries have got to deal with, regardless of what people think about climate change. It's kind of extrapolating out to where we think the world has got to be in 5, 10, 20 years' time. And one thing that defence planners have got to do is have those conversations, because we have to build forces that can deal with those challenges in 5, 10, 20 years' time. I would like to just add that the UK has, just in the last few weeks, become, I think, the first country to no longer have coal-powered power stations. We've reduced our greenhouse gas emission by about 50% by the 1990s. I think, someone will fact check me, that we were the first country to build a coal-fired plant in 1844, and our last one has just closed. We are moving to using kind of renewables as much as we possibly can. I think it's important on all of us to work out what we do about this kind of green transition that we're all in. I do think it's one of those challenges that we are not addressing as much as we will need to in the decades to follow.
Well, I think that climate change is very important for NATO, and it's a very integrated part in the discussion that we have. Because this will be a security threat to all NATO countries. And therefore also Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, at least he was that until the last week, he focused tremendously on how we can contribute to a green transition. And we've seen in several European countries now that Russia has used gas as a weapon. So therefore, we needed to increase our gas export to the European countries. But this is only for a transitional period of time. We really need to step up in order to introduce new sources of energy. And this is one of the very few positive, I would say, consequences of the war. We have seen huge investments in the green transition all over. And now even in Texas, we see that, companies invest more in green technology than in fossil fuels. So if we don't step up in the green transition, that will be a security threat for all of us.
Maybe very briefly on that, where do we see the effect of climate change the most? In countries that are very poor, being it, for example, Africa. In these countries, they also have very valuable resources for us. So if we see the effects of climate change on these poor countries that bring instability, they bring socioeconomic instability and other forms, unrest, we can also see some malign actors stepping in, using the chaos that it creates, being it, Russia, being it China, being it other actors that do not align with our democratic values. So yes, it is for us a threat, and we should definitely look into addressing that.
And just one more comment on the climate change. If you see the changes in temperature in the high north, it's actually 3 or 4 times higher than in other areas. So we can expect actually more activity up in the high north in the future because of climate change. And that could also potentially be a threat to all of us.
So for the first audience question, so the U.S. has restricted Ukraine's use of long-range ballistic missiles in Russia out of fear of Russian retaliation and in many ways existing treaties. Do you see this position changing in the future as Russia continues to escalate the conflict in Ukraine? I think they're looking at you.
Was that directed at me?
I not by name, but I think by topic.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll find out in a month. Really, more than that, right? January 20th, I guess we'll find out. Without placing a value judgment on my assessment here, I think it's pretty clear that the two candidates have different views on the war in Ukraine. And I expect, given what I have read and heard of each of them, or heard each of them say, that we would probably not see a lifting of those restrictions under a future Trump administration. And I do not know if we would see one under a Harris administration. There's potential there, I would expect the Harris administration to continue the flow of assistance to Ukraine, again, given what she said to date and what I know of her advisors and what their views are. I do not think the Trump administration would continue that flow of weapons, and so I think the question would be maybe a moot point under a Trump administration.
I would add that this is on the record, and if whoever asked that question wanted to ask me it off the record, at the end of the session, I'd be very happy to answer it.
I'm happy not to comment the U.S. policy, but I can tell you our Polish position on that. I think what we've been looking in Poland into, and I mean this has been also a discussion that we said we would like to have, with the NATO allies, is actually about missiles that are flying over the Ukrainian territory. The trajectory is coming to Poland. So this is something that we consider as a threat. We believe, that should be also discussed within the allies, and the Ukrainians should be able to defend itself from the threats that are coming from Russia. They are not offensive, they are defensive. Instead, of bombing civilian infrastructure like the Russians are doing and killing civilians, the Ukrainians are not killing Russian civilians.
I'll add one thing, which is that we are seeing the Iranians provide the Russians with a huge amount of material. I don't think the Iranians put any restrictions on whether Russians can use those weapons.
So similar to that, and change the order of questions from what I'm pulling to kind of skip down a little bit. So in light of this discussion, so what would NATO's agenda look like in the aftermath of a potential Russian-Ukrainian war? And what shifts do we see in policies to prevent then future invasions of other European countries and potential Ukrainian involvement in NATO?
Would you like to have the first crack?
Ooh, that's a difficult one. Well, so our Polish position is that we would like to see Ukraine joining NATO because we think that Ukraine needs to have a very strong security guarantees, and only the NATO alliance is capable of giving these guarantees to Ukraine. Our government position is that we're looking into invitation for NATO for Ukraine. I mean, we understand, of course, that it has to be the decision of all the allies. And we know the discussion on that, we had this discussion before the Washington summit, but we also have, clear sign in the declaration, in the communique that yes, the Ukraine's path is NATO. So that's our Polish perspective on that.
That was also adapted during the NATO summit last year, that Ukraine's future belongs to NATO. So it's a question of when, not if. So I think the security debate after the war is stopped is that we will never ever, start to rearm Europe the same way as we did in the 90s. So, because what we thought in the 90s was that there would be peace with Russia. We tried from the Norwegian side for a very long period of time. If you go to a town very close to the Russian border, there's a statue of Stoltenberg's father. His name is Thorvald Stoltenberg. He was foreign minister of Norway, and he tried really to develop the bilateral relationship between Norway and Russia for years. And the first foreign minister I met with was Foreign Minister Lavrov. I think we were right to try, even though we failed. But I don't think we will make that mistake again of not spending so much time on defense as we did in the 90s. So from 2008, the Norwegian government at that time took an initiative during the NATO summit at that time and said now, the armed forces in very many European countries now know more about the valleys in Afghanistan than we know about our own waters. So we really have to step up our military presence here in Europe, and we can really see changes also in Russia. So this has been a development over the last years, we really have seen a huge and tremendous step up now. But from a Norwegian perspective, we have seen these changes step by step in Russia in an even more authoritarian direction. We can see it between universities, for instance. We had a lot of student exchange between Norwegian and Russian students. In the beginning, it was very easy. It went very well. But after a time, there were even more authoritarian regulations in all universities. And we could see that in cultural institutions, in museums and everywhere. So slightly, step by step, Russia has been moving in a more authoritarian direction. And they are now more authoritarian than in the 70s and in the 80s. So we really have to pay attention in the future about our own security by being strong on defense.
With regard to how NATO might change after Ukraine becomes a member, and I think they ultimately will, right? I mean, the alliance has said Ukraine is on an irreversible path toward membership. Just last month, a summer research intern and I, Elizabeth Nielsen, published an article in the journal Survival on what Ukraine in NATO, or really what NATO looks like the day after the irreversible path, okay? So once Ukraine gets in, and it won't be an overnight thing, right? Every government has to ratify the addition of a new member state. It'll take some time. But when that happens, what does NATO have to do? And we think there's some pretty serious implications in 4 different areas. First, NATO's going to have some troops in Ukraine, right? Unless there's an allied presence on the ground, the Russians are likely to reinitiate a war. The second is the Black Sea needs to be beefed up in terms of security, right? When the war ends, the Turks are going to take off their prohibitions on Russian warships entering and exiting the Bosporus. The Russians are likely to rebuild their naval presence in the Black Sea. The third is with regard to hybrid operations. We expect an amplification of Russian sabotage, assassination attempts, other hybrid attacks all over Europe, maybe even expanding them beyond the countries they've been active in lately. And then finally, strengthening the flanks. And we mean specifically the north and the south, where we expect much more in terms of Russian violations of airspace, Russian use of EW to affect commercial civilian air. So anyway, we lay it out in this article in Survival. More broadly, you know, I spend a lot of I'm on the research faculty, so they pay me to go and do research and write about the things that I'm learning about. And I spend time wandering the hallways in NATO headquarters and in the Ministry of Defense in Berlin and the MOD in London or in Warsaw. And I must tell you, the things I hear are an increasing awareness across the alliance, across political parties in different countries in Europe, that we are not returning to what the relationship was during this period of post-Cold War, pre-Crimea, okay? That Russia is a persistent, not merely acute, but a persistent threat to Europe. And picking up on what the ambassador said, you know, referencing one of your excellent CNAS scholars, Andrea Kendall-Taylor, you know, she has written about the impact of an increasingly personalist authoritarian regime in Moscow. And that's what we're seeing. It's increasingly personalist. It's all about Putin. These kinds of regimes are more risk tolerant, they are less transparent, and they're more aggressive than other authoritarian governments and than other governments writ large, okay? So this is the challenge we face. And I suspect, and I think most Russia watchers also suspect, it will not end when Putin dies, right? This is becoming endemic in this system. It'll be a long-standing challenge, and I think the alliance is standing up to it. I would wish they'd be a little faster, though.
And really quickly, I agree with what the ambassador said. I agree with what John said. It's about restoring deterrence, and it won't just be about having the right army footprint in Ukraine. It'll be working out what Ukraine needs to make sure that there can be no return to conflict and that we are able to deter Russia from making the same sort of moves in other parts of the European theatre. I think there'll also be some thinking about how we can stop this kind of developing relationship between Iran, North Korea, Russia, China from deepening, and how we can work to split apart this axis of resistance. Which is probably a kind of whole separate question that we might get onto later.
So something that we talk about a lot is the NATO as a consensus-based organization. So how does NATO manage disagreements as that consensus-based organization? Are there reforms that might allow for better cooperation? And how do individual member states actually manage that consensus-based need?
It's a lot of due diligence, right? I mean, we have, each member has a permanent mission in Brussels. What does that mean? It means there's an ambassador and a staff, right? And you can imagine the Americans are kind of first among equals here. Our vote doesn't count any more than anybody else's, but we're the big player in the alliance, so we've got a pretty robust mission in Brussels. And we've got diplomats all over Europe that help us to understand what's going on within the allies, to understand what's happening at the international level. And then the allies meet and discuss. This is one of the benefits of the alliance. Every Wednesday, the ambassadors to NATO meet in North Atlantic Council. That's what we call it. They meet Wednesday in Brussels and talk about what's on the agenda. And it's that day-to-day interaction that is critical to facilitating the consensus. And sometimes there isn't consensus, right? I mean, the allies disagree sometimes very deeply on issues. But it's that day-to-day interaction that facilitates cooperation and collaboration. Now, some have argued that, hey, as the alliance gets bigger and bigger and bigger, doesn't consensus become more difficult? Isn't it more difficult to get 32 to agree than it was to get 16 when they first started? That's true to some degree, but what we see in practice is that allies form subgroups with particular views and issues, and when a new one is added, it's not like we have a 33rd subgroup. That new ally joins one of the others on any particular issue. And so to date, it's been mostly manageable. I think that's the way it'll continue, but we'll have to wait and see.
What I can say, I mean, I fully agree that there's a lot of due diligence. I mean, there's a lot of work being done in Brussels, a lot of work being done in Washington and other capitals. But also, I think if 32 allies right now are capable of agreeing of a text of a communique that is, from the summit, I think 5 pages long, I think that's a tremendous success. We are able to name the threats, and we are able to name the means how to address these threats. So I think, that's a great example of how the allies should be working together. How they have been working and how they should be working in the future.
There's a lot of very long meetings. There's a lot of meetings that finish at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. It gets a lot easier to compromise when you really want to go to bed. I joke, but also, the nature of that compromise, the nature of our systems, the fact that you can get a number of countries who have thought very deeply about their security cooperation in one room and want to talk about the right answers to it, shows why our systems are so much better than the kind of tin pot dictators that we're up against. And, it stands in stark contrast to that axis of countries who want to trample on our values, make sure that we're not able to have those conversations, and demolish that rule-based international order. So, meetings, having the right values, coffee, bed.
But at the end of the day, members of NATO, we share the same values. So, we reached consensus because we know that this is absolutely necessary. So I think that all NATO members know that, at the end of the meeting, we will reach a consensus even though it will last for a very long period of time. So it's very different from other international organizations like the World Trade Organization, for instance, where they don't reach a solution, or the UN. Here we share the same values, so at the end of the day, there would be a consensus.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience.
So, considering everything that we've talked about tonight, one of the questions that I'm seeing a lot, and I'm paraphrasing from a couple of different questions here, is how should we actually understand what NATO is for the average American, individual states in America, and why it's valuable for individuals and the American collective in this world as we live in and as we go forward?
I mean, it's back to where we were at the start, right? It is the bedrock of transatlantic security. The European, US, we mustn't forget Canada, conscious of how far north we are, alliance, the prosperity that we share, the world that we have built together since 1945 relies on NATO, relies on it ensuring security and stability and prosperity. And I would hope that everybody in this room would like to see security, stability, and prosperity continue.
I think NATO membership is not only about the US come to assist Europe in case of a war or an invasion. It's also about European countries taking care of American security. We do that in very many, we do that, you talked about ISIS, for instance, that was about, our common security. We take care of American security up in the high north. So I think a lot of countries in Europe contribute really to American security by being a part of a common security alliance.
And I'll just maybe add one more thing to that. All this defense spending that we were talking about, that Poland, 4.2% or so on, the vast majority of it is being spent here in America, in the U.S. defense industry, U.S. defense companies buying equipment in order to prepare us to be able to deter the threat to the Euro-Atlantic territory.
Just to add briefly, I think Mark hit the point that I would hit on, the role of NATO in maintaining stability and security for our economic benefit, right, for our way of life, really. But I'll touch on something the ambassador mentioned, and that is the role of Europe beyond Europe for American security. In our defense strategy, we call our allies a center of gravity, right? That means something very specific in the military world. The center of gravity of your strategy is the bit that your strategy depends upon. So we recognize we cannot meet the challenges we face in the Indo-Pacific, in Europe, everywhere, in military realm, the economic realm, diplomacy, politics, etc., without allies by our side. And in fact, they're our comparative advantage because the Russians and the Chinese don't have that.
Okay, unfortunately, we are at the end of our time. So I want to thank all of you in the audience for coming this evening and remind you that you are invited to join us for a reception just outside the auditorium. I also want to express my sincere thanks to Kate Johnston of the Center for New American Security for the time and energy she devoted to making this event happen, and to my colleague, Dr. Nick Howard, for his assistance with the Q&A. And of course, we are extremely grateful to our panelists for being here this evening, and I would ask that you join me in thanking them for sharing their insights on the relevance and future of the NATO alliance. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.